Hey guys, Derek here from Back to Reality. And over the past few years, we've been slowly trying to answer some of your most frequently asked questions about gardening under deep mulch, and more specifically, the Ruth Stout method. For more information about that method and why we prefer it, as always, I've placed some links in the description. But today, I'd like to really quickly talk about crop rotation, because this one comes up fairly often, and it's a question that, honestly, we've really struggled with as well. So, first of all, what is crop rotation, and why is it typically recommended? Well, the basic idea is that when planting the same crop over and over again in the same spot, you risk depleting the soil of specific nutrients and amplifying the effects of possible pests. This is especially true on large-scale farms when planting huge monocultures, because all of the plants have the same nutrient requirements and suffer from the same diseases. So in essence, over time, you end up with too little of the stuff you want and too much of the stuff you don't, meaning that your crops could eventually start to suffer or even fail. So to prevent this monoculture problem, farmers have traditionally avoided planting the same crops in the same place for too many years in a row, and instead alternate between different types of plants from one year to the next. Often in a 2, 3, or 4 field system that would allow multiple seasons between each species. Hence the name crop rotation. But it's important to point out that this is rarely a problem in nature, because nature rarely produces true monocultures. Instead, the natural world is filled with complex ecosystems made up of many different types of species all living together, which is why many crop rotations also include a fallow year, or in other words, an entire year where the field is given back to nature, so that all of the weeds, insects, bacteria, and whatever else happens to turn up can all just do their thing. This helps restore the soil fertility and prevents any specialized pests from gaining too much ground. So crop rotation sounds like a pretty smart solution, and for literally thousands of years, it's served farmers really well. But it's not the only solution. For example, many modern farmers now use chemical fertilizers and pesticides. This has the benefit of restoring the specific nutrients required by their preferred crops and preventing any pest and disease outbreaks before they even get started. But there can also be some pretty serious drawbacks to this approach, especially if you're concerned with organic food and the environment. So finally, a third option is to simply avoid monocultures in the first place, and instead plant polycultures, where many different types of plants are all grown together in close proximity. This way, like in nature, you retain a much more complex ecosystem, where both the nutrient requirements and potential diseases are more evenly dispersed. The only problem with this approach is that it can be really complicated on a larger scale, especially when using heavy machinery to sow, maintain, and harvest your crops. But luckily, the question wasn't asked about large-scale farms. So now let's get back to our garden. Because so far, though we've certainly thought about it a bunch, we've never actually implemented a crop rotation. I mean, we have moved our plants around a bit while trying to determine which veggies we like best and how many we need, but we've never actually intentionally avoided replanting the same plants in the same place. In fact, in some cases, we've actually avoided avoiding it. You see, unlike in a large farm, trying to find a good rotation for your entire garden can be kind of complicated. For one thing, you need to consider a much larger number of different types of plants, and some places just make more sense for a specific purpose. Like, for example, this large bed that we created for our corn. Or this bed where we've set up permanent trellises for our tomatoes, cucumbers, and beans. Plus, we have some perennial veggies like our asparagus, strawberries, chives, and other herbs that can't be moved. Oh, and let's not forget about the veggies that only grow for part of the season, like the cool weather-loving broccoli, spinach, and radishes. Or the hardneck garlic that gets planted late in the fall and harvested in July. So trying to factor in all of these exceptions results in a scheduling nightmare, especially if you're also concerned with companion planting. And frankly, most of the techniques that we're interested in are supposed to bring us closer to nature and avoid unnecessary labor and stress. So in order for us to go to all the trouble of a proper crop rotation, it would have to be worth it. And honestly, I'm just not convinced that it is. Now, as you can probably tell, we are not gardening experts. On this channel, we're just trying to share our own experiences and pass on what we've learned along the way. So for this question, I think it's best if we rely on those who actually know what they're talking about. And since we're talking about the Ruth Stout method, let's go straight to the source. In her book, Gardening Without Work for the Aging, the Busy, and the Indolent, Ruth is pretty blunt when she writes that rotating crops is nonsense. And she goes on to say that for many years I rotated my crops not because the scientists had me buffaloed in this respect, but because it seemed as easy to do as not. So why not humor them? Then I decided that it actually wasn't quite as easy, so I began the revolt by asking myself if it was necessary in my way of gardening, where the soil was constantly renewed by rotting mulch. The next question was, why don't we also have to rotate asparagus, rhubarb, raspberries, roses, and oak trees? Our asparagus has been producing on the same spot for 30 years. My final step was to stop rotating, and nothing seems to object so far. And Ruth isn't alone in this, because from what I can tell, plenty of modern gardeners have come to the same conclusion. Like, for example, Charles Dowding, who in his book, Garden Myths and Misconceptions, classified the statement, "Crop rotation is important for improving soil fertility," as often untrue. I'll also link to a few videos from other YouTubers in the description. So if crop rotation isn't truly necessary, then why do so many people think that it is? Well, once again, I think it goes back to those large-scale farms, because in that case, it really is a benefit. But a typical garden is not a huge monoculture, and it isn't managed using heavy machinery, so it doesn't have the same types of problems, nor does it have to rely on the same types of solutions. For example, if we zoom out a bit, we can see that compared to a large field of corn, our garden is actually a pretty impressive polyculture, with many different types of plants all growing in close proximity to one another. So a concentration of pests is just not as likely to form, and frankly, even if it did, simply moving a few plants from here to here is still not likely to make a huge difference. Plus, most gardeners amend their soil in some way, be it with compost or manure, or in the case of Ruth Stout, and us, a thick layer of old spoiled hay as mulch. So the soil nutrients are far less likely to become depleted, and in fact, it's far more likely that the fertility will increase over time. So at the end of the day, if you have the time and it's not too much stress, then crop rotation is certainly not a bad thing, and it can even provide some benefit in some situations. But in general, from what we can tell, it's also not a necessity, and you shouldn't feel guilty for skipping it. And most importantly, please don't let it get in the way of simply trying to grow some of your own food. Because as I've said before, what's most important is that you do it, not how you do it. And on that note, I'd like to leave you with one more quote from Ruth in her book, How to Have a Green Thumb Without an Aching Back. At the end of an entire chapter about the sometimes dogmatic approach taken to gardening advice, she perfectly sums up what I think is the best approach. She says, "Gardening is like cooking. Read the recipe and then use your head. A dash of skepticism can do no harm. Go lightly on caution, heavily on adventure, and see what comes out. If you make a mistake, what of it? This is one way to learn, and tomorrow is another day." Thanks for watching, and we'll see you soon.